Hi, welcome. What a great crowd. Thank you so much for coming out tonight. Thanks for coming to Governing in the Dark, Evidence, Accountability, and the Future of Canadian Science, and braving the weather to come out tonight. I want to say just a quick few things. Thanks to Scott Findlay for coming out to Halifax from Ottawa. It's obviously people... There's an appetite for this type of discussion. And events like these don't happen on their own. Thank you very much for support from Canadian Centre for Ethics and Public Affairs, Evidence for Democracy, what Scott is part of as well, Department of Physics and Atmospheric Science at Dalhousie University, and Situating Science. I'm Emily Tector. I'm the project coordinator for Situating Science. This is a national networking and partnership building project funded by the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. We promote communication and collaboration among humanists and social scientists that are engaged in the study of science and technology, connecting folks via workshops, conferences, lecture series, summer schools, and more across the country and internationally. We have dozens of videos, publications, podcasts, blogs, hundreds of events available on our website and YouTube channel, so check that out, and live streams as well. It is situsci.ca, Google Situating Science, or situsci.ca. We are joined by other folks virtually tonight via live stream, so hello to them. There is a reception, I should mention this, a very important information, reception afterwards. So this would be just outside the doors in the main hall area. It's a good opportunity to linger and network and maybe speak with a couple of us and Scott himself. This event marks part 3 of the Lives of Evidence National Lecture Series, which examines the cultural, ethical, political, and scientific role of evidence in our world. So far, we had renowned bioethicist Carl Elliott speak on psychiatric research abuse, which we will post online shortly. And before that, Cindy Patton on inventing the crystal meth HIV connection, now available on our YouTube channel. After Scott, we have Jim Brown coming. He's a Canadian philosopher of science who will speak on patents, progress, and commercialized medicine at King's, Thursday, March 20th. Then you'll be able to still watch the rest of the series live online from the comfort of your home. Joel Lexchin, professor in the School of Health Policy and Management at York University, will speak from Western University on the role of evidence in the pharmaceutical industry and clinical trials. That will be Thursday, April 10th. Finally, the Canada Research Chair in Philosophy of Science, Stathis Silas, will speak on the War of Science trend. It's nothing new. In Ottawa, April 10th, then Toronto, April 16th. Also of interest, by the way, most of these will be streamed live online, so check out our website for more information on those. Also of interest, locally here tomorrow night at SMU, there at 6:30 in the Sobe building, there's a public forum on science communication and stereotypes. We'll also, for those of you who know of the science and technology studies field, Donna Haraway will be streamed live from Edmonton on March 24th. So see our website and social media for details and updates on all of that. There are feedback forms on your chairs. For a list of upcoming events, just flip those over. Some of the March events only, there's much more, from sponsor organizations. Without further ado, here's Tom Duck, who's been very vocal about the future, or lack thereof, of Canadian science. He is a professor in the Department of Physics and Atmospheric Science, and will quickly introduce our speaker. Thank you.
Well, thank you for all attending tonight. It's been a difficult last few years for science. We've seen very, very deep cuts to science programs, the unprecedented muzzling of scientists, and the gutting of science-based legislation. All of these issues exploded onto the national scene with the Death of Evidence March in 2012. Now, I want you to imagine the scene. You have the Grim Reaper leading thousands of lab-coated scientists carrying a coffin up to Parliament Hill. They drop the coffin on Parliament Hill, and they mourn the body of evidence. Get it? Huh? Okay? All right. The event was a tremendous success, in large part because of the humor and the sincerity that people brought to it, and it brought this national attention to the issues. Now, Scott was one of the visionaries behind that event. Since that time, he has become one of the most important voices in Canada regarding science and its role in democracy. He's also one of the founders of the new group, Evidence for Democracy, which I'm sure we'll hear at least a little bit more about tonight. So with that being said, would you please all help me welcome our speaker, Scott Findlay, professor from the University of Ottawa.
Thank you very much, Tom. It's a pleasure to be here to talk about, as the title suggests, governing in the dark, evidence, accountability, and the future of Canadian science. This is an ambitious canvas, and let me be frank right at the outset that I'm not a particularly adept painter, so you'll have to be content with a couple of amateurish daubs. But let me begin by putting a couple of cards on the table. The first card I'd like to put on the table is the science card. I'm a scientist, and I'm a scientist for three reasons. The first reason is admittedly selfish. Science is a hugely seductive intellectual exercise. The eureka moment in science is intellectually orgasmic. I have no personal experience with this, by the way. I have it on hearsay from reputable sources. The second reason that I'm a scientist is less organic, but I think it's equally compelling. Just like everyone else, scientists too have values. Values like good health, safe streets, economies that work, good health, healthy environments. These are all values to which scientists cleave. And science might be, as has been mentioned, a mad pursuit, but it's actually a pursuit of the knowledge that's required to sustain these values. And we can't lose sight of this. Science is an exercise in building the knowledge required to ultimately sustain the values about which we care. The third reason, though, that I'm a scientist is actually the most important reason, and it's an attitudinal reason. Science should teach us to be skeptical. And particularly, or in addition to being skeptical about things, we should be skeptical about our science. It teaches us to ask, what is the evidence supporting that claim, or in the vernacular of science, that hypothesis? For scientists, talk is of little consequence. What matters is evidence. Let me put another card on the table. I believe in science-informed decision-making. In fact, so do all of you. Every conscious action you take is based in part on expectations about the consequences of that action. Those expectations, in science, we call predictions. In science, predictions are simply what we expect to happen in a particular experiment if our explanation is true. For example, suppose I get up in the middle of the night to use the washroom, and unfortunately, as I age, an increasingly common occurrence, and I flick the light switch, and nothing happens. Being a scientist, I'm pondering the inscrutable workings of nature and wondering why it is that the light doesn't turn on. One hypothesis is that the light bulb's burnt out, so I can do an experiment. I can simply take a new bulb, screw it in, flick the switch, and if my hypothesis is correct, the prediction is the bulb will light. All of you, I am sure, have done this sort of experiment dozens of times. So all of you are scientists. Science really is kind of bred in the bone. Thomas Henry Huxley, some of you remember, Darwin's bulldog, 150 years ago, said that there's nothing exalted about the scientific method. It's merely the normal working of the human mind. So we are all practicing scientists, whether we recognize it or not. And that is important. Let me put a third card on the table. I believe very strongly in the goal of peace, order, and good government enshrined in Canada's Constitution, and I believe that it depends critically on governments collecting, gathering evidence, carefully examining it, and using it appropriately in decision-making. Laws, regulations, and policies are attempts to manage human behavior for the public good in precisely the same way that clinical interventions, therapies, if you will, are attempts to manage disease for the well-being of the patient. Clinical treatments, the success of those clinical treatments are based on the accuracy of the cause, what we call the causal hypothesis, the diagnosis, if you will. If we have misdiagnosed the problem, the treatment will fail. And so it is with policies and laws. All such instruments, as I've said, are simply attempts to try and manage human behavior, and they depend, the success of those depend on the appropriate and accurate characterization of the underlying causal explanations. I might believe, for example, that the reason that people commit drug-related crimes, in part, is because the existing punishments are insufficiently severe to deter them from so doing. If this hypothesis is correct, then introducing increasingly stringent or more stringent punishments should have the desired effect. However, if it's not correct, it won't. So if laws and policies are fundamentally based on what scientists refer to as causal hypotheses, there's actually two reasons or two questions that should spring immediately to mind. First, what's the evidence that these causal explanations are in fact true? The second is, if in fact the success of those policies, regulations, and laws depends on them being true, shouldn't we give some thought to the possibility that we've got it wrong? Because, as Lord Bolingbroke observed, truth may have a narrow compass, but error is profound. Let me put another card on the table. Thomas Jefferson believed that democracy depended critically on an informed populace. So do I. Jefferson was right in 1776. He's even arguably more right today. Uninformed opinion is, in the words of Harlan Ellison, the scourge of democracy. Even in these trying times of a pervasive and corrosive sense of entitlement, I believe that nobody is entitled to be ignorant. There is a political mindset dating back to Disraeli that politicians shouldn't retract, they shouldn't recant, they shouldn't apologize, they shouldn't explain. Now, science doesn't have much to say about apologies, but the notion that one should not explain from a science perspective is nonsense. In fact, it should be nonsense for everyone. Democracy is rooted in the twin principles of accountability and transparency. I would argue that both demand that government decisions and their justifications be made explicit. Being made explicit means bringing forward the evidence to support those decisions, evidence that the actions that are taken by government are likely to achieve the required objectives or the desired objectives, or at least unlikely to have unintended or surprising consequences. Canadians may disagree on what goals or objectives are desirable, but informed public opinion demands that all the evidence, however unpalatable, be brought forward in unfiltered form, carefully evaluated, and publicly debated. To do otherwise breeds credulity. And that way, as William Kingdom noted, savagery lies, if not madness. And here finally we come to my central thesis. To repudiate evidence-informed decision-making is to govern in the dark. Indeed, there are two darknesses, that of the governed and that of the governors. Those who would govern without being appropriately informed by evidence have perhaps some sort of sense or sensibility by which they can feel their way along a path. Maybe it's an ideological path. Maybe it's a political path. Whatever path it is, if evidence-informed decision-making has been repudiated, it's not a path illuminated by the light of evidence. What about the governed? If they don't possess that same sense or sensibility, how are they to follow the path? What if they don't possess that? If they do, they can follow the path. But if they don't possess it, what are they to do? These poor unfortunate, these ideologically or politically challenged, they are like the proverbial blind man in the dark room looking for a black cat that isn't there. If they want to move, they can do so only by clutching at the hands or maybe the hems of those who would govern. They cannot see what path they tread. They know not whither it lies. To move is an act of blind faith. Here then is the final card that I will lay down tonight. It is the trust card, but not the blind trust card. Blind faith in government is not only unscientific, it's dangerous. We know, we've seen this movie before, many times during the course of human history, and it's never had a happy ending. What precisely is the trust card and why is it so important? I'm going to put that aside for a little while because I want to return to this issue of evidence and science. Many of us in the scientific community and elsewhere are concerned by what appears to be a retreat, maybe even a flight, from the use of evidence in evidence-informed decision-making by governments. This trend goes hand in hand with what appears to be a decreasing investment in what has been characterized as public interest science, science in the public interest. This in an institution which is not only one of the principal engines of social progress, but I and many other people believe is the taproot of enlightened democracy. What's the evidence for declining public interest science? Well, let's begin with the science done by government. Science capacity is crucial if governments are to discharge their fiduciary, their statutory or their regulatory responsibility. All of this depends on scientific information. Those responsibilities include such things as environmental protection, the protection of individual rights and freedoms, the construction and maintenance of transportation infrastructure, protection of public health, the provisioning of effective social services, to name just a few. Yet the public interest science capacity of the federal government is being eroded. This has taken the form of a long list of science-related institutions and programs that have been cut, shuttered, or terminated, including the position of the National Science Advisor, the demise of the long-form census, the Contaminants and Marine Toxicology Program, the Experimental Lakes Area, the Roundtable on the Environment and Economy, and the list goes on, and I don't want to belabor the point. Moreover, recent data from Statistics Canada suggests that in fiscal 2012-2013, for the fourth year in a row, federal science and technology funding has declined, with most science-based departments and agencies experiencing cuts. Federal intramural research and development spending continues to fall, dropping 3% in fiscal year 2013-2014, contributing to an 11.9% decline over the last 4 years. Recent estimates suggest that over the past 5 years, more than 2,000 science positions have been lost from the federal government, and more are expected as the Minister of Finance attempts to balance the federal budget for 2015. Of course, the federal government is highly committed to balancing the budget, and this is a laudable objective. I think everybody can agree that that's something worthwhile. And because it's committed to balancing the budget, one might expect that intramural science programs, just like everybody else, will experience some cuts. The question is, at what price? Despite a markedly less rosy economic situation south of the border, and by the way, an astronomical federal debt, Mr. Obama's 2014 budget plan included a 9.2% increase in federal non-defense research and development spending. These increases reflected Mr. Obama's view that economic exigencies notwithstanding, investment in federal government scientific research is crucial to the welfare of Americans. Well, if it's so important, why not let business do it? Simple. Corporate science serves the interest of the corporation. Even the most zealous proponents of Adam Smith's invisible hand, even they understand that corporate interests and the interests of the public need not align. Corporation has no fiduciary responsibility to look after the public interest. Why not let academics do it? There's a lot of academic scientists out there. You'd think they'd jump at the chance. Well, we have to understand the difference between academic science and government science. Academic science, its responsibility is knowledge generation. Government science is supposed to inform programs, policies, regulations, and laws that are, one hope, intelligently designed to sustain and maintain Canadian values. And if you're going to have that type of science, this relies heavily on systematic, long-term monitoring and surveillance, often in partnership with provincial, territorial, First Nation governments. Only governments have the infrastructure to do this, and indeed the fiduciary responsibility. This is why we need This is why this type of science cannot be outsourced to, on the one hand, the business community, or on the other hand, academia. It's not just me that believes this. In a recent Environics poll, 73% of respondents consider the top priority of government science to be science in the public interest, including protecting public health, the environment, and safety. There are other worrisome trends. Since 2006, there has been an ongoing shift in the resources associated, on the one hand, to basic or curiosity-driven research, and on the other hand, to business-related research. Between 2007, 2008, and 2013, 2014, funding for the three major scientific research councils has fallen by an average of about 6% in inflation-adjusted dollars. For example, since 2008, annual unfettered research funding at the Natural Sciences and Engineering Research Council has declined from $389 million to $321 million in 2010 dollars. And so this is an example of where the emphasis seems to have shifted from, on the one hand, basic curiosity-driven research to research that is designed to support the private sector. Now, I think it's important to bear in mind that, of course, one needs both types of research. In fact, the whole spectrum of research along the research, the ecosystem spectrum. But the issue is, what is the appropriate balance? The concerns voiced by the scientific community about the emphasis on research, on basic research versus business-related research, I think, have been heard. If you look at Economic Action Plan 2014, it includes an apparently untargeted $46 million for the three major research councils, representing an increase of about 1.7%. So it's entirely possible that the federal government has heard these concerns of scientists about perhaps trying to restore some of the balance between, on the one hand, basic or curiosity-driven research, and on the other hand, research that's designed to serve the interests of business. There's a sentiment in some quarters that basic research amounts to indulging the curiosity of scientists on the public dime. But consider this: the modern-day laser is the combination of decades of work that began in 1917 with Albert Einstein, doing basic research. First working laser we had in about 1960, with bona fide commercial application not happening until the mid-1970s. So from basic research to commercial technology, we're looking at, in this case, a span of over 50 years. The laser is one of a host of commercial technologies that, their diversity notwithstanding, they have two things in common. First of all, their origins as basic research. And secondly, they were a long time in gestation. And this time component is very important. Science is a rather tortuous and convoluted path that winds its way with many switchbacks and feedbacks from the wellspring of basic research to a whole bunch of outflows, including technological innovation. And the critical point is, along these paths, things move slowly. Markets, on the other hand, operate on much shorter timescales, as the fates of RIM and Nortel attest. So companies can go from darlings to dog in the case over the course of a couple of years. And this difference in timescales is important. The market clock ticks fast. The clock of science ticks slowly. So that the only science that's worth doing is that is of commercial value, and it must be delivered apace with the ticking of the business clock, then the result is 100% predictable. Investment will only be at the end of the research path. And the problem with that, of course, is that if you think of this tangled set of paths from the wellspring of basic science to the outflow, if all the focus is put on the outflow, you might get a temporary increase in production, productivity, technological innovation, but your pipeline dries up. What's our most valuable natural resource? Oil, fish, timber, water, people, creativity and imagination. That's our most valuable natural resource. And creativity and imagination come from curiosity. The natural world is the natural focus of the inquiring mind. And to my mind, this is the real value of basic research. Curiosity-driven research. To stimulate creativity and imagination and to fire it, to temper it in the crucible of the scientific method, to give it rigor, a rigorous construct. That's the real value of basic research. And that's something that one doesn't hear in the public discourse about the relative advantages of basic research, curiosity-driven research, versus business-oriented research or research concerned with commercialization. If science is to serve the public interest, it must not only be conducted, but it must be communicated. Last November, the Professional Institute of Public Service released the first results of a survey of more than 15,000 government scientists seeking information on, among other things, the communication and dissemination of government science. Its report, entitled The Big Chill, reported that 90% of the over 4,000 survey respondents felt that they were prevented from speaking publicly about their scientific work. And more than one-third reported having been prevented from responding to questions from the public, the media, over the last 5 years. I would say that this is worrisome. More worrisome still is the fact that fully one quarter of respondents apparently have been asked directly to exclude or alter information for non-scientific reasons. Almost half know of instances where their institutions suppressed scientific information. 71% of respondents believe political interference has compromised Canada's ability to develop evidence-based programs and policies. The PITSI survey adds to the growing pile of anecdotal reports of political interference in the communication of public interest science, ranging from restricted access of journalists to scientists to communication policies that constrain the flow of scientific information, not only between federal government scientists and the public, but among scientists themselves. Concerns have been raised by a wide range of institutions, ranging from the Canadian Association of University Teachers, the Canadian Science Writers Association, the Royal Society of Canada, and recently the University of Victoria's Environmental Law Clinic successfully petitioned Information Commissioner Suzanne Legault to investigate the legality of the government's communications policies. Now, a compelling case, I think, at least at times, can be made that federal government scientists should not be commenting publicly on government policy. And let's face it, there may well be circumstances under which the disclosure, the full and open disclosure of scientific information, may not actually be in the public interest. But a government that's committed to inform public debate should not discourage its scientists from communicating and disseminating their science unless there is an overwhelmingly compelling reason for doing so. The consequences of impeded scientific communication are far-reaching. Science is an intellectual crucible that depends both on the freemasonry of and unfettered communication among government, industry, academia, and NGO scientists. Impede this communication, and you've got a problem. I think this problem was best summed up by my colleague, Dr. Jeff Hutchings, who noted that if you impede the communication of science, you impede science itself. I can't say it any better than Jeff did. My second claim is that we are experiencing what I've referred to as a retreat or a flight from evidence-based decision-making. As is the case with the shuttering of public institutions and the closing of government research programs, the evidence is, there's a growing body of evidence. But let me just highlight a couple just to give you sort of a flavor. In Canada, supervised drug injection requires an exemption from the prohibition of possession and trafficking of controlled substances under the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act. The Act provides for exemption in the discretion of the Minister of Health for medical and scientific purposes. So as some of you may know, in 2008, one such facility, Insight, located in Vancouver's downtown east side, applied for a new exemption. The minister at the time indicated that he would deny the application. In an effort to keep Insight open, a case was brought before the BC trial court, arguing the application of several sections of the Act violated charter rights of Insight clients. The trial judge granted the exception, and it was permitted to continue to operate. The Attorney General was unhappy with the decision and sought an appeal. The appeal was dismissed. The case eventually wended its way right up to the Supreme Court of Canada, which upheld the decision of the original trial court. On what basis did the federal government want Insight closed? Well, part of the argument was that harm reduction sites and similar initiatives are not only harmful to human health, but they actually prolong addiction. This claim was dismissed by the trial judge, it was dismissed by the appellate court, and it was dismissed by the Supreme Court. In fact, in the Supreme Court decision, they wrote, "Insight saves lives. Its benefits have been proven. There has been no discernible negative impact on the public safety and health objectives of Canada during its 8 years of operation." Consider now the case of the mandatory long-form national census. The rationale provided by Minister Clement was that it was too intrusive. He also suggested that the data from a voluntary national household survey would be an adequate substitute. When he made this suggestion, there was a firestorm from the professional public survey community, professional science, survey science community. And it was relentless, it was implacable. In their view, not only was there no evidence to support this contention, there was compelling evidence the other way. And it was here that Mr. Clement made a tactical error. In a Globe and Mail article, he intimated that he had got this advice about the substitutability of the National Household Survey for the long-form census from Stats Canada itself. Stats Canada had done no such thing. And indeed, it was the intimation that Stats Canada had done that led to the resignation of Dr. Munir Sheikh, the chief statistician at Stats Canada. In his resignation letter, he explicitly repudiated this claim that the National Household Survey was a viable substitute. And indeed, there are problems. A bunch of the information from the National Household Survey has been withheld by Stats Canada because of concerns over data reliability. Let me conclude with a third example from the natural sciences. As part of the massive omnibus bill of 2012, the Fisheries Act was amended such that the habitat provisions now were specified fish species of commercial, recreational, or aboriginal, contributing to aboriginal fisheries and other species that supported those fisheries. In particular, the amendments removed prohibitions on alteration of habitat, and the protection provisions of the new amended statute simply required demonstration of serious harm. So this flew in the face of a large body of scientific evidence about the importance of habitat alteration on fisheries and fish species communities and on potential extinction risk associated with those habitat alterations. The question was, why was the Act being so amended? And the rationale that was given was that it was obstructing projects, it was resulting in lengthy delays, and so on and so forth. But an empirical analysis, actually two empirical analyses of the Department of Fisheries and Oceans' own information, could find absolutely no evidence to support this point. So I've provided here some of the evidence, I think, that's consistent with the claims that on the one hand we've seen a decline in federal investment in public interest science, and on the other we've seen a retreat, if perhaps not even a flight, from evidence-based decision-making, or evidence-informed decision-making, let me say. I don't want to belabor the issue. I believe, as do many others, that neither of these trends is in the interests of Canadians. So what might be done? For some time, I and others have believed that we need a national organization that would advocate for public interest science and for the use of evidence in government decision-making. And we now have such an organization, Evidence for Democracy, and that's precisely what Evidence for Democracy is. It's a national, nonpartisan organization that advocates for both those things. It's explicitly an advocacy organization. But I believe we need more, and I believe that all of us have something to contribute. My view is that there's a real need for scientists to become vocal advocates for the public interest, for public interest science and for evidence-based decision-making in general. I realize this is difficult. It's not something we are trained to do, and we have some legitimate concerns about it. We have concerns that when we start to become advocates for public interest science, or indeed advocates for anything, we start to enter the world of politics. And if we enter the world of politics, somehow we lose credibility, our scientific objectivity, if indeed there is any such thing, starts to be compromised. I can assure you that once you start to become an advocate for anything, it becomes political. But it need not become partisan, and that's a crucial difference. Nor do I believe that you have to sacrifice, as a scientist, the principles as scientists that we cleave to. I believe that one can do both those things and perhaps even do them effectively. I also believe that for scientists, a little humility is needed. We sometimes think that we know more than we actually do. A number of commentators have made the suggestion that, in fact, science may be coming close to becoming the new religion. And this is problematic in my view. We have to remember that all science is fallible, and fallibility notwithstanding, there are transcendently important issues in Canadian society to which science and scientists really cannot speak with a privileged voice. And it's important as scientists that we recognize that. What can politicians do? Three things. First, if there are any politicians out there, if you say you're going to do something, then do so. Show us the evidence that has informed these decisions, and please do so on your own volition, rather than in response to yet another access to information request. In handing down his decision in a famous legal case in England in 1923, Lord Hewart observed that it is of fundamental importance that justice should not only be done, but should manifestly and undoubtedly be seen to be done. The same principle applies to evidence-informed decision-making. If one commits to doing it, one also commits to ensuring that one demonstrates that one has in fact done it. Why? Because a sine qua non of science is the full and open disclosure of scientific information so that we can have constructive and rigorous scientific debate about the nature of that evidence. Now, it's interesting. Following the Death of Evidence rally in 2012, I noticed a real upswing in communications from the federal government and speaking notes in the use of things like evidence and science. Less than a month later, after the Death of Evidence rally, in responding to questions about the Northern Gateway pipeline, the Prime Minister asserted that the only way that governments can handle controversial projects of this manner is to ensure that they are evaluated on an independent basis scientifically and not simply on political criteria. Several months later, again as part of the 2012 Omnibus Bill, the government amended the Navigable Waters Protection Act so that only projects potentially affecting a select set of water bodies would be subject to federal review. How was the list of designated water bodies determined? According to Transport Minister Denis Lebel, this is science talking, and we will continue working that way. In March 2013, Minister of Natural Resources Joe Oliver advanced the view that President Obama is, on Keystone XL at least, driven by facts, adding, and that's what drives us as well. But saying it so, I think everybody knows, doesn't make it so. So I would say to Mr. Harper, Mr. LaBelle, and Mr. Oliver, indeed anyone who claims to be making decisions on the basis of scientific information, show us the evidentiary beef. Second, and I'm referring to the politicians here, show Canadians you are serious by putting in place institutions that sustain and protect public interest science and promote evidence-informed decision-making in government. Here there's a bunch of suggestions that have been made. One is to engage members of the scientific community in trying to elaborate some sort of a system for determining the appropriate allocation of federal monies from all stages, at all stages of the research and development process, right from the investment in basic scientific research to end of pipeline sort of technology commercialization, technology innovation. And as I pointed out in one of my earlier comments, of course one needs the full set of investments. It's a question of getting the balance right. Another is to establish a parliamentary office for science and technology to assist parliamentarians in understanding the scientific information relevant to decision-making and more specifically to exercise some oversight on the use of evidence in decision-making by the federal government. Something rather like this has been recently suggested by Kennedy Stewart, the NDP science and technology critic, in the form of a bill for a parliamentary science officer currently before the House. Still another suggestion has been the establishment of an independent science audit or report card that would provide regular progress to Canadians on the state of and the consequences, the impact of the investment of federal dollars in science and technology, both in the public sphere, public interest science, and in business-related science. Third, and this is the most important one for the politicians, if there are any of you out there, I really wish you'd stop treating us like we're a bunch of potato heads. The other morning, I don't know how many of you listened to The Current, but the other morning I was listening to Anna Maria Tremonti interviewing Pierre Poilievre on the Fair Elections Act. Did anybody hear that interview? It was a very interesting interview. Ms. Tremonti asked the minister why, under the amended act, Elections Canada was no longer going to be able to advertise in an attempt to get out the vote. And Mr. Poilievre's response was, well, despite the efforts of Elections Canada, voter participation in elections continues to drop. And there was a pause, and Ms. Tremonti asked, well, are you saying that because of the actions of Elections Canada, that's the reason why voters aren't turning out? And the minister said, you know, of course not. That's not what I'm saying. And in a follow-up clarification email to the Post Media, he said, I'm not arguing that Elections Canada advertising drives turnout down. Rather, it fails to drive turnout up because it does not address the practical obstacles that prevent many from voting. So everybody here knows, of course, it's entirely possible that but for the activities and the efforts of Elections Canada, voter turnout would be even more abysmal than it is. It's entirely possible, in which case Elections Canada's efforts are having an impact. Moreover, the fact of the decline doesn't allow one to say anything about the reasons for the decline. Perhaps, just perhaps, I'm just throwing that out there, maybe the reason that people don't show up to vote is because they feel, I don't know, disconnected or disenfranchised from the political process. Maybe it's got nothing to do with them not knowing where to cast their ballot or how to do it or when to do it. I mean, we do live in the information age, after all, so it just seems a little unlikely that that's the reason that voter turnout is continuing to plummet. This sort of argument, which I hear all the time, just infuriates me, and it infuriates me for quite simply. It seems to me that there's two explanations for that. On the one hand, it's possible that those that give these types of arguments don't actually see that they're only superficially plausible, or they have these logical flaws that you could drive a truck through. Maybe they don't actually see those things. But the other possibility is that they do see it, but they think that we don't. And frankly, I'm not sure either of those is very reassuring. So what can the public do? I've talked about the scientists, I've talked about the politicians, let's talk about the public. I think there's three things the public can do. The first one is become one of us. I mean, not by vocation, but by attitude. Embrace your inner scientist. Become skeptical. Remember that there's a difference between superficial plausibility and truth. There's a big difference. Remember things like absence of evidence is not the same as evidence of absence. Those are two fundamentally different things. But it has this veneer, this Angstrom thick veneer of superficial plausibility, which we're smart enough to understand, to dig through. Second, if economic action turns your crank, think carefully about the economics of evidence. Remember that it's your tax dollars that are invested in programs and policies designed to achieve some objective. And often, that's a lot of money. Now, if you entertain the possibility that we could actually have it wrong, the first thing that we can ask and should ask is, well, what's the evidence that this particular policy or program will actually achieve the objective? You can think of it as a form of insurance. We all buy insurance, life insurance, car insurance. It's a relatively small investment to save ourselves potentially huge amounts of money further down. We invest a little bit in the gathering and the evaluation and the dissemination of evidence, and it may actually be well worth it economically, just for precisely the same reason that everyone in this room, I'm sure, purchases insurance. Finally, take ownership in the public interest. Remember science in the public interest. Take ownership of science in the public interest. Remember that it's your interest. Remember that it's your values. It's your values that public interest science is supposed to sustain or maintain or enhance. Think about the sort of science that's needed not only to sustain your values, but the values of your children and of those who will come later. And make sure that these views are known to those who make decisions about the fate of our public science institutions. What's the future of Canadian public interest science? That's the title of my talk, and let me say, frankly, I think I may have got you here on a bit of false advertising, because I actually don't know what the future is. But I do know two things. The first one is that the fate of public interest science in this country and anywhere else is inextricably related to the fate of democracy. Those two are inextricably linked. And the second one is that I know that the fate of public interest science will not depend on the activities of professional scientists, nor will it depend on the efforts of politicians. It will depend on the efforts of that interesting beast, that interesting person that everybody talks about, but nobody, as far as I know, has ever yet encountered: average Canadians. Thank you.
Thank you, Scott. We have time for a Q&A. As you can see, there are two mics set up on the here in the corridors, I guess you'd say, of the hallways of this building. My name is Ian Stewart. By the way, I'm involved in the History of Science program at University of King's College. When Tom and I thought of having Scott come, and we thought about a venue for this for tonight, I had a little bit of effort convincing Tom that we should have it here, because he was afraid that there wouldn't be enough people, but there clearly is enough people, which speaks to the broad concerns of Dr. Findlay's talk, the subject matter of his talk. So to get to Q&A, please use one of the two mics, and two rules, please, or one suggestion and one rule. The suggestion is that please state your name, and if you have any affiliation that you want to bring up, please mention that. And secondly, please keep your comment or question brief. We do want to leave time for the reception, which is going to be out there in the atrium area, just to your right as you go out. But we do have about between 15 and 20 minutes, depending on how things go. So please keep your questions short in the interests of good polity of a public event such as this one. Thank you. So we'll start over here on the left. Yeah. Professor Worm.
Yeah. Thanks for the wonderful talk. Quick question. You said this is a political issue. It's not a partisan one. I'm really, to go with your title, in the dark about whether this is something that's rooted in a particular political movement or whether this is something that has been ongoing and creeping up on us for a longer time through various governments and maybe even an undercurrent in Canadian society or maybe even in Western civilization, a disregard for science, underfunding of science. You mentioned the US taking another course, but do you see this as a societal occurrence or more so as something particular to particular governments?
I guess I would say that I don't think this is a new phenomenon. I think this has been going on for some time, and that's why I say it's a political phenomenon in some sense, but it's not a partisan one, because we've seen this kind of thing, I think, in other governments, not just the current government. Arguably, it's reached what I hope is its nadir under the current government, but I don't think this is something new. I guess the more interesting, or another question that's equally interesting is, what's the cause of it? Why is it that we seem to be seeing this retreat from evidence-informed decision-making, or this kind of retreat from science in some sense? And I guess I would say that, and it relates to the trust issue, I think that there is a general malaise in society today, and that malaise is a malaise of mistrust. And it's a mistrust for politicians, it's a mistrust for science. And I guess that might be one of the reasons that we have this kind of retreat. And if we want to re-engage with the public as scientists, I think we have to regain their trust.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. Derek Lynch. I'm a researcher in the agricultural faculty here. I'm actually currently president of the Canadian Society of Agronomists, which includes many federal agricultural researchers as well across the country. And they're very concerned and have participated in that survey you cited about their science and communication being curtailed. I kept picking up on one term you kept using, in the public interest. What if ideologically the issue is not about science-based decision-making per se, but it's about the concept of public interest? And fundamentally, one is up against an argument, a political argument, that there is such a thing as the public interest, or in the words of Maggie Thatcher, that there is such a thing as society. And maybe fundamentally, and I would just suggest to you in future presentations, you may want to consider not necessarily conflating science-based decision-making with public interest, because I think there's two pillars to the debate, really, as to whether there is public interest. And science-based decision-making, there may be in the private interest, but not necessarily in the public interest. One has to. And so my question, I guess, is how does one tackle that issue of whether there is fundamentally a public interest worth gathering evidence for?
I guess I would say that maybe the way to define the public interest is to do it by trying to define what it isn't. And I guess I would think one way to think about this is, well, you have a bunch of values to which the public cleaves, and some of those I think I've already articulated: healthy environment, healthy body, healthy mind. It's not clear to me that those things are in the private interest, but it's certainly the case that for many, many people, the vast majority of people, they all have an interest in those kinds of values. They all share those kinds of values. So I guess you might think about defining operationally the public interest as something that's not specifically in the corporate interest. That's not to say that corporate interest and public interest can't overlap. The other point that I would make, and I think you're absolutely right on this, is that there are these two things. There is, on the basis, on the one hand, evidence-informed decision-making from science, and on the other hand, science in the public interest, what we're calling the science in the public interest. And those two things, it seems to me, are to some extent independent of one another. And I think we have to keep the two of them straight. I don't want to get, because it's not really my area, to get into a discussion of what defines the public interest, but as a naive natural scientist, it seems to me that there are things that are not in the necessarily in the corporate interest, and that seems to me a reasonable operational definition.
Hi, Scott. Thanks very much. That was a great talk. My name's Bob Bailey. I'm the VP academic at Cape Breton University and also an environmental scientist. I guess I wanted to hear a little bit more about advocacy among scientists. I share your trepidation about advocacy as a scientist. Not so much in the context of pushing for evidence-based decision-making, which I think we can all stand behind. I think it gets tricky when, or at least for me, I define my role as an environmental scientist in the public interest as saying, if you do this, here's my best guess as to what the consequences of doing that are, whether it's building Keystone or building this mine or whatever. And then I consider it society and then inevitably politics, which gets into what choice is made about what's done, as opposed to taking on an advocacy role about what I think should be done and using my scientist mantle to give me some sort of credibility in that advocacy. Can you maybe talk a little bit about that?
I think this is a very important point, and it's a point that I think that lots and lots of scientists struggle with. I want to be clear. On the one hand, we have sets of values, some of which we share, some of which we don't share, and arguably, one might say that, well, the role of science is once those values have been defined, say, for example, you define consensually a healthy environment in the public interest, then you may go to scientists and say, given that that's a goal that we want consensually to achieve, to work towards, how do we go about it? Give us your best guess as a scientist as to how we go about it. And that's where the advocacy role for evidence-based or evidence-informed decision-making comes in, is as scientists you can say, you have decided that this is something that collectively you want. It's my job now to gather the evidence, to assess the evidence, and give my estimation of the best way to get there. And that way, if you do it that way, then you're not going to be getting into the situation whereby you're trying to make a scientific case for what is fundamentally a value issue. And when we think about, at least when I naively think about partisan politics, I tend to think about parties having different sets of values to which they cleave. And that's not, in my view, the kind of thing that scientists necessarily have something that's they're not particularly well suited, or they're better suited than anybody else to give an opinion on that. But when it comes to the issue of actually being able to give a professional opinion on, given that this is the value, how do we get there? That's where the role of science is. Does that answer the question?
Because this is a live-streamed event, that means there are also live-streamed questions. I'm just going to dip into one of them. This is coming from Sean. As an ecologist graduate student, or ecology graduate student, I'm wondering what advice you have for young scientists. How can we direct our careers such that we are contributing to a culture of evidence-based decision-making?
Whoa. Well, okay. I guess one of the limitations that I really have as a scientist operating in this kind of environment is I was trained as a scientist. You know, I like to think, maybe I delude myself, that in the areas that I know something about, I'm a reasonably good scientist. But when you start to move into a political environment and an advocacy environment, there's a whole bunch of skills, aptitudes, capacities, attitudes that one needs to operate effectively. And don't get me wrong, I'm not implying that I'm operating effectively at all, but I've come to realize that there's a whole set of skills and attitudes and capacities that one needs that your normal scientific training, your conventional scientific training doesn't give you. And to the extent that I've learned them at all, and I'm not sure about that, I've had to do it on the seat of my pants, and I guess my advice to somebody who's coming up through science ranks who wants to use his or her training as a scientist to advocate for evidence-informed decision-making, my advice would be to develop those kinds of skills, capacities, and attitudes in particular that are going to make you more effective in that kind of environment. And my experience is that that's not part of the usual science training. And the parenthetical comment to that, of course, you know where I'm going with this, is that maybe it ought to be.
Chris Micah, I wear a number of hats, including as a writer for Rabble and research associate for the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. Scott, I wanted to, you've been talking about the death of science-based decision-making and muzzling of scientists, things that are alarming enough in and of themselves. I wanted to add one further layer to this that touches on something we were talking about earlier today. Just 10 days ago, Robert Bruhl, who's an environmental sociologist at Drexel University in the United States, published a rather major study in a journal called Climate Science, in which he looks at the funding for the climate change denial movement. And he was able, just in the time period between 2007 and 2010, document $558 million, over $500 million of funding from organizations like Exxon Mobil, the Koch brothers foundations, and so forth, to a whole spectrum of different organizations. So what do we make? Now, we've always had people who denied the reality of the Holocaust or didn't believe in evolution. But in my view, this is something of a wholly different order of magnitude, a massively corporate-funded campaign whose purpose is to confuse people, to create disinformation about a vital topic. And we've seen both some of that funding cross the Canadian border to fund organizations like Ethical Oil and the Fraser Institute, and some of that bogus science used in Canadian context. What do we do to combat that kind of influence that is actively seeking to undermine even the evidence that is not being suppressed?
I guess what I would say is I actually have a lot of faith in the public's intelligence. And my view, and you probably got this from my talk, is that I very, very firmly believe that if we can up the level of what I would call constructive skepticism, a constructively skeptical attitude in the public, then the public will start to be able, by virtue of that attitude, start to be able to see some of these things, to parse some of these types of arguments. And as we raise that level, the level of discourse goes up. So the kinds of things that used to work in the past will no longer work, because the public will say, forget it. You're not convincing me by that type of pathetic argument that you tried to convince me with about 5 years ago. And I guess my feeling is, yeah, corporate interests or anybody else's interests are going to invest money in doing science. We've seen this in the biopharm industry, for example. But if we can at least raise the level of skepticism in the public, maybe they can start, maybe we can start to actually to make head or tail of those arguments. That's the only thing that I can think of. I don't happen to have a very deep pocket that I can compete with the oil industry. Not that I would ever even want to, actually.
Thanks.
I think we have time for one more question or two very quick questions or comments.
Hi, I'm Matt McLeod. I'm the Vice President of the PIPS Research Group that represents federal researchers and First off, I'd like to thank you for raising these issues on behalf of those of us who can't always speak freely ourselves. My question is actually sort of along the same theme as the previous questioner, though, that I've been reading some articles about universities and where it's more the corporate money that is funding research but not allowing those researchers to speak about their findings and, you know, keeping it very focused or limited to that one corporation. I'm wondering if Evidence for Democracy is looking into those sorts of issues as well in terms of restrictions on academic researchers sharing their findings.
This is an important issue. I can say that at the present we're not, primarily because we got our hands full with other things. I think this, you know, the corporatization of academe is an issue that's been of concern to lots of people for, well, probably more than a decade. And by corporatization, I don't just mean, you know, the corporate investment in academic research, but also kind of the corporate business model for academic institutions. This is a long-winded way of evading the question, which is basically, I would like to be able to do that, but we just don't have the resources to do it at the present time.
My name is Stuart Lamont. I'm a live lobster exporter. I'm also a member of Coastal Community Advocates. Your recommendation to the public was that we become one of you, embrace your inner scientist. I, for one, am doing my very, very best. Over the last 3 years, I don't think I've missed a single rerun of The Big Bang Theory. On a related point to the previous questioner, there's a certain irony that we're here at Dalhousie University listening to your comments this evening about the death of science-based decision-making, and I applaud you for your efforts, but I did want to talk about the exploitation and potentially the politicization of science within the academic community. This particular university, of which I'm a graduate, has signed a contract with NSERC and Cook Aquaculture to study the benefits of open net pen fish farming in Atlantic Canada. And it is done so under the leadership of a professor in this university who has a known track record of supporting open net pen fish farms. When I raised this apparent conflict of interest with the senior vice president of research in this university, she said this is an issue of academic freedom, that we're entitled to study virtually anything under virtually any circumstances as long as there's some peer review at the end of the process. I'm wondering if you could comment on the distinction between academic freedom and academic integrity within the science realm. Is there a fundamental commitment where academic integrity must trump academic freedom, or am I just a little too idealistic?
I guess I'm not sure that there needs to be a trumping going on. It seems to me that my view of what academic freedom is that in an academic environment, you want to have the ability of people to pursue a wide range of ideas without fear of retribution. So this is what, to my mind, constitutes academic freedom. Academic integrity, especially as it applies to scientific research, would be, given that you've decided to investigate a particular issue or a problem, that the principles of the scientific method and the impartial evaluation of evidence applies in that context just as it applies in any context. So it seems to me that these are horses of a very, very different color. What it is that you choose to pursue your research on, the subject matter of your research, and the integrity of the methodology that you apply to that pursuit. That's perhaps my naive, but I think kind of a useful characterization of the two.
A useful comment, a PS to that, is that enshrined in the idea of scientific integrity is that any clearly non-impartial research can be questioned using the same standards of integrity that Scott's alluding to. So that's, and I'm sure that will happen. A number of students want to ask questions, so I'm going to extend the Q&A for a bit just to allow them, since we are here in a university after all. Please feel free to give your name and make your comment or question briefly.
Hello, my name is Juan Carlos, and I'm a student of physics and mathematics here at Dalhousie. And as a fellow scientist, I also share a view for the public outreach of science. And I can assure you that it's also a really good feeling to get an idea out to, for example, somebody else, and just seeing that click, for example, of sharing an idea and seeing them receive it. It's a really good, satisfying feeling. But as a scientist, I feel like I personally don't have a really good ground on politics. So I feel like as a scientist, or as a group of scientists, we are knocking at their door and maybe they're just shooing us away. And I was wondering, how can we implant that in our current education system to teach these politics to younger generations and even scientists today?
I think your experience is a pretty universal experience, and this is what I was saying about scientists who want to get into this kind of environment, finding themselves not particularly well equipped to deal effectively in these environments. And I think we're seeing now, and my own institution is an example, where we recognize that this is a problem, and we're trying to develop academic programs that would, for example, start to train scientists. Those are students that have been trained in the natural, physical sciences, biomedical sciences, in the policy world. So they start to understand the policy process, they start to understand the complexities of the policy process, they start to understand, you know, this thing, yes, Scott, but don't you realize, I hear this all the time, don't you realize that decision making is more than just science? Yeah, I get it. It's important that these other things are taken into account, and they should be taken into account. But as scientists, we don't actually have a good feel for those kinds of things. I mean, this is not something that I'm particularly knowledgeable about, but what I can say is I think that there is a recognition among scientists that if we are going to operate in that kind of environment, we have to do a better job of training ourselves. And so we're starting to see programs addressing precisely this lack of expertise.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you. Hi, my name's Catherine. I'm unfortunately no longer a student. I wish I were. I'm the energy coordinator at the Ecology Action Center. It's a local non-governmental organization. So I want to thank you for your talk. I was so eager to hear you speak. We're not at all talking about the systematic dismantling of our scientific capacity in this country. During your talk, you speculated that either governors don't see the logical fallacies and gaps in their reasoning, or somehow think we won't see them. And I agree with you that neither of those is a very comforting possibility. But I would suggest a third possibility, and that is that governors do see those logical fallacies and gaps, are well aware that we can see them, but are confident that even if we do see them, we won't affect their ability to act or question their authority. And I wonder what you have to say about that possibility. And this kind of strange interplay of like hubris and apathy.
It is a logical possibility, yeah. But I must say that I was reluctant to even contemplate it, because if the first two are chilling enough, the third one is even more chilling. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a logical possibility. I just hope that's not the case. It might be a forlorn hope, but
okay. You hope not.
Well, I mean, if that is in fact the case, then we have really seen this movie before. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, I hope we're not there.
Yeah. If we are there, how do we break through?
Well, if we are there, we got more to worry about than evidence-informed decision-making. In which case, you don't want to be listening to me. Yeah, I prefer not to contemplate that option at this stage.
Thank you.
One final question, please, on the left there. Student question.
Hello, my name is Clarice. I'm a student at King's. And I'm basically just wondering, in light of all of the dismantling of institutions, and I kind of have in mind like the library closures of the DFO and places, the closure of venues for scientific communication and debate. I'm wondering if things were to get better, let's say maybe in 2015, and we have a sudden policy change by the government, to what extent do you think that the shutdown of those institutions will make it really, really difficult for a renewal of the same kind of, like how hard would it be, even if we change tomorrow, to bring back those, to sort of restore those things that have been lost or damaged?
I think this is a big problem. You know, once you shut something down, once you terminate something, you lose a bunch of things. If you eliminate the archives of information, and by the way, we've seen this movie before, you eliminate archives of information, then you have no baseline. You got to start afresh. If you dismantle scientific institutions, it's not just the bricks and mortar, it's the people. Right? You have this effect of the connections between people, and those intellectual connections are gone. Those are hard to reestablish, very hard to reestablish. But worse, by far, is that, and this is the thing, I must say as an educator in the university, this is the thing that I find so appalling, is that I'm actually starting to hear amongst undergraduate students them saying things like, I'm not going to become a scientist even though I'm interested in it, because nobody is interested in science anymore. I mean, this as a scientist is chilling, because that's a legacy that persists. You know, it's you folks that are the next generation of scientists. And if we are, by the attitude towards science, if we are eviscerating the future scientific community of Canada, this is hugely problematic. I hope that's not the case. But I've actually heard that from some of my undergraduate students. So you shut these things down, there's a legacy effect. Absolutely.
The question of the role of knowledge in shaping society, governing society, encouraging society is obviously one, if Scott is right, that involves all of us, not just governors, not just elite scientists, but every citizen. The breadth of that reality is clearly reflected in the breadth of the types of folks who are out here tonight, from the university world, from the NGO world. Pleased to recognize the presence of the office of Megan Leslie, MP for Halifax here, and the person of her constituency assistant, Phyllis Larson, and but also people from the general public concerned about this question. So thank you all for coming here, and let's, in the spirit of Scott's talk, let's continue to be concerned about the future of science, broadly conceived as skeptical, critical inquiry. Thank you to the Center for the Canadian Centre for Ethics and Public Affairs, to the Department of Physics and Atmospheric Science, to Evidence for Democracy, and of course to Situating Science for making tonight possible. I remind you that there is a reception going on just outside to the right, up the stairs. And lastly, join me in thanking our speaker, Dr. Scott Findlay.